One piece of news caught my eye this week. EcoHealth Alliance, the American research company that had been up to its neck in questions around bat coronavirus research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, they have been given a new funding contract by the US government. This comes after a 3-year suspension. Now, you might think that in itself is completely outrageous. Although it's worth noting that to date, nothing has been proven in relation to work they carried out being linked to anything that did or could have leaked from the Wuhan lab to cause the recent pandemic. There is lots of shade to be thrown their way for all sorts of reasons, some of which is argued about and disputed, but certainly not that. However, what's truly interesting is the number of new constraints that have been added to their funding. Without saying that things were done badly, the implication is sort of that things were done badly. First, the National Institute of Health, which is funding the work, has forbidden them from carrying out any research in China, and it has banned the collection of bat or human samples. Second, it has prohibited scientists from culturing chimeric viruses, in other words, manipulating viruses in ways that have the potential to increase the virulence or transmission of a virus, a key aspect of gain-of-function research, which Dr. Anthony Fauci denied the NIH was funding, although some have contradicted his view on that since he made it. In addition, EcoHealth Alliance has been told its work has to be carried out in laboratories which are rated as biosafety level 3, which is the level used to study infectious agents or toxins that can be transmitted through the air. As we've noted before, previous work on bat coronaviruses were being carried out at biosafety level 2 facilities, much less stringent. The article discussing this in the journal Nature was full of scientists celebrating the news, saying the grant should never have been terminated in the first place, driven as it had been by politics and fueled by unsubstantiated rumours. For instance, Gerald Cush, associate editor of the National Emerging Infectious Diseases Laboratory Institute, said in relatively robust form, "It's about goddamn time. The integrity of science requires a barrier against political interference." Angela Rasmussen, a Canadian virologist and active supporter of the Natural Origins group, said that she was pleased to see the grant renewed, but hopeful that the onerous restrictions would not apply to other scientists doing similar work. So, will EcoHealth Alliance be able to carry out its work with all these onerous new restrictions? Well, their controversial president Peter Daszak says that they will be, and he told the Telegraph newspaper this: "We have many untested bat and human samples from other countries. We realise that we can still answer fundamental questions about coronavirus spillover even without further sampling or laboratory work in China." It seemed that the most straightforward way to move forwards was to propose to NIH that we do no on-the-ground sampling in China or elsewhere, that we replace the recombinant virus work with computer modelling and protein binding experiments, and we conduct any bat coronavirus culture at BSL-3, biosafety level 3. I can't help but see this as an admission that what happened in the past was badly judged, whilst they're trying not to admit any fault or liability at the same time. I mean, if you specify that work that used to take place in biosafety level 2 laboratories must take place in biosafety level 3 in the future, are you not saying that it should have been done that way in the first place? Viruses that can spread via aerial transmission is the definition. Does that not sound like the special sort of hell that we've been living in for the last 3 years? If we've decided not to do on-the-ground sampling of bat coronaviruses, does this not suggest the entirely intuitive conclusion that finding such viruses and transporting them to major centres of population might carry with it some risks? I mean, it sounds to my untrained ear like a statement of the bleeding obvious. But here we have some scientists moaning and hoping that other researchers won't be constrained by tightened restrictions. And it seems that the research can be carried out via computer models rather than by creating chimeric viruses in reality in the laboratory. Is there not an argument that that would be a better approach all round? Given recent history. Researchers who spoke to Nature said that it was good the funding was being renewed because, quote, this type of research is essential to avert the next pandemic. Really? Such an argument is only possible from people utterly certain in their own convictions that the previous work didn't just cause one. Also, how much help was the previous work that had been carried out in averting this pandemic? For me, I just don't think it's good enough. Researchers may decry what they call political interference, but given the huge consequences, what we non-experts do have a right to demand is political oversight. Now, there's no escaping this, is there? Yes, politics can be a crappy process, particularly so with the current culture wars making anything and everything a vehicle for some of the most stupid divisiveness. But if not political oversight, then what? Oversight of the experts by a peer group of other experts, all of whom share similar interests related to their expertise, all of whom are not held directly accountable to the electorate? Don't think so. A basic rule of new technologies and risky research should be that just because you can do something doesn't mean you necessarily should. But scientists and specialists generally are very bad judges of what they shouldn't be allowed to do. That's basic human nature. I'm reminded of what happened a few years ago when, in a totally separate emerging field, a Chinese researcher went rogue and used CRISPR genetic engineering on human embryos. The whole scientific community was united in condemning it. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison for what he did. But I noted one argument that another researcher made at the time. With CRISPR, such an amazing tool, he said, the last thing we want is to turn society against it by some mistakes made early on. Now, I agree with that statement, but it also reminded me of the situation with virologists and the question of the origin of COVID-19. Elaborate conspiracies to one side. The interest of any professional group not to be blamed for a hugely damaging situation like a pandemic is obvious, short-term, intuitive. The actions of some researchers who quickly wrote papers alleging evidence that turned out to be actually quite thin on the ground for a natural origin, their actions seemed understandable in the light of that immediate and short-term interest. Protect the value of the work we do from bad consequences if mistakes have been made. Now, that may not have been their motivation at all. People argue vociferously about that, as they probably should. But it's entirely within the bounds of how ordinary, organised human beings behave that it might have been. So the idea that some should so lightly dismiss the concerns and rail against what seem to be entirely appropriate restrictions does make you feel as though a significant portion of that community have failed to learn any lessons whatsoever. Because you should be able to believe entirely legitimately that, in fact, on this occasion, COVID-19 did not leak from a lab, while still acknowledging that valid public policy concerns would place restrictions in this area to reduce the chances that it might do such a thing in the future. The fact that some US government agencies believe the lab leak hypothesis to be highly possible should mean that we review and tighten up what we do as if it was a leak that caused COVID, whether we know that for sure or not. those who dismiss that out of hand, who regard it as nothing more than political interference. Well, I respect their expertise in their own field, but I do not trust their instincts for where the boundaries should be drawn. They are not experts in public policy. They are not experts on risk management. And to be honest, they seem to have something of a humility deficit. Should we be carrying out research on viruses? Well, of course we should. We have an interest in understanding this area as well as we possibly can. Has anyone reassured us that the appearance, at least, of cavalier disregard for common sense in how it was done in recent years, that has been removed? Not really, no. Molecular biologist Richard E. Bright, who has been an active participant in the online fights on the other side, so bear that in mind of course, said that the new restrictions on the EcoHealth grant meant that the research would be, quote, less reckless. But he added that it didn't erase previous bad practice across the industry. If there's a reason why he's wrong about that, I'm entirely open-minded, but I haven't yet seen it in the comments that have been made by people on the other side. More like variations on the old saying, I didn't do it, I didn't do it, and what's more, I won't do it again. I don't think that's good enough. Do you? Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.